In August 1979, Scotland, a tragic incident happened. The Wildrake diving accident. Just about everybody in the diving industry who was around in the 1970s and the 1980s will be familiar with the devastatingly tragic Wildrake diving accident. It took the lives of two young American professional divers, 32-year-old Richard Walker and 28-year-old Victor Guiel. It happened when the early development of the North Sea oil and gas industry was going through its worst period of accidents. This particular accident sadly exemplified the highest level of greed, corruption and incompetence reached by the offshore diving industry in the North Sea. It is important to emphasize that it was not the norm, it was a worst-case scenario. Equally, it must be appreciated that the North Sea has since changed fundamentally and it is now the most popular and the safest place to work among offshore divers. It is undisputedly where the safety standards are currently the highest in the world. In early 1978, Brian Masterson, an English businessman and engineer, co-founded Infabco Diving Services Limited, a commercial diving company. B&OC awarded Infabco a contract for diving services from the drill rig Ghana alongside the Thistle Alpha platform. Investigative reporter Brian Gold would later discover that B&OC's offshore construction manager, Joe Singletary, vacillated in Infabco's bid by allowing Masterson to examine his competitors' bids. After the Wildrake accident, B&OC Security Division in Grampian Police investigated the possibility that Masterson had bribed B&OC's officials for contracts. On 18th June 1979, B&OC contracted with Infabco to reinstall the SALM on its base on the Thistle field. On 29th of July, the two divers, 32-year-old Richard Walker and 28-year-old Victor Guiel, entered the saturation habitat on the diving support vessel, the Wildrake. They began their pressurization procedures to a working depth of around 520 feet or 160 meters. The Wildrake is a diving support vessel constructed for and owned by Anders Wilhelmsen as a Norwegian shipping company. It had a saturation diving system where the divers live and work for about 28 days in the moon pool, which is an opening in the center of the ship, so the dive bell can be lowered from the deck through the hull of the ship and directly into the water. The single anchor leg mooring, or the SALM, is a tanker loading facility that allowed oil from the Thistle oil field to be transported to land, where a submarine export pipeline did not yet exist. At 11 p.m, the men were suited up in their hot water suits. These suits were an essential component of saturation diving. One of the many tubes fed through the umbilical cord to the bell contained hot water. The water flows through their scuba suits to keep them warm. The temperature in the North Sea was 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The umbilical also had tubes to provide their breathing gas mixture and electricity, as well as cords for depth gauges. The bell was designed to be sealed with a double door system that would allow the pressure inside to be raised or lowered to match the depth where the work would be performed. This pressure would also allow the hatch doors to be opened without flooding the interior with water. When one of the men performs the work outside the bell, the other man would remain inside as the bellman to monitor CO2 levels, air pressure, communications, and the umbilical of the outside man. At 11:40, Richard slipped into the dark water to start the night's work. He performed many of his tasks and started using a video camera to show the base to the dive superintendent up on the ship. After a few passes with the camera, he turned to return to the bell. What he saw was confusing for a split second, but then it became strikingly clear. The bell was much closer to the seafloor and was hanging at a 45 degrees angle. He directed his camera to the bell to show the topside team as he instantly moved to the bell, knowing that he had to get inside before it got any closer to the bottom. In one of the unusual design flaws of this bell, there was no frame to hold the bell off the sandy bottom. As Richard moved to the bell, Victor was inside, cracking the gas valve open to increase the pressure inside the bell since the entire bell had dropped 25 feet. The icy water was starting to rise up the trunk. It was 2:45 a.m. when Richard informed the topside of what he saw. The lift wire was no longer connected to the bell. He came up the trunk and pulled the inner door closed as he and Victor tried to figure out exactly what had happened up on the ship. The bell team realized that the lift wire had broken and the bell was actually dangling by its umbilical. The video screen had gone black and no communications were coming from the bell. Out on deck, Another huge problem was revealed. Hot water was spewing all over the deck from the umbilical. The gas line and depth gauges still seemed to be working properly. The bell team could see that the internal pressure of the bell had increased, indicating that the guys were both inside, and they had increased the pressure to seal the door shut for now. At 2:57 in the morning, the bell team reached out to the nearest dive ship, the Stena Welder. They only stated that they had an issue and to stand by for potential assist distance. Now 3:45 am, and the clock had officially started ticking. Their hot water line had been severed, and their most pressing issue would be hypothermia. They followed procedures and opened their survival suits, which turned out to be foil blankets and instead of the full body suits they expected. At 4, the Stena Welder was finally asked to make the rescue. The two ships went back and forth with instructions and equipment. But by 5:45 the issues were resolved. Two Stena Welder divers, Eddie Frank and Phil Casey, were heading down to connect the wire and make contact with Victor and Richard. Originally, the welder group planned to lift the bell themselves to help facilitate the transfer, but Brian Masterson had something different in mind. He directed them to connect the Wildrake's own lift wire to the bell, and that he would be the one to rescue the men. It seemed like a ludicrous suggestion to the diver superintendent on the Stena Welder. They were directly over the bell location for the safest lift angle, and the Wildrake would have to reel in the bell at a 45 degrees angle, which is completely unheard of in commercial diving. It went against all best practices, but Masterson wasn't a diver, he was a businessman. His compounding mistakes seemed to continue without anyone able to effectively object. The welder's bell was down at the target area, but had to search around for more than an hour to even locate the bell. When the Wildrake crew gave the coordinates, they forgot that they had moved the bell away from the SAM base hours earlier, forgetting to update the location coordinates. This might not have been a problem if the bell transponder had been in place, as it had been for the previous 29 bell dives. Now Frank and Casey need to walk in a wide arc around their bell to find the lost men in a terrible stroke of bad luck. At 6:44 am, Casey entered the water to start the search, and more than an hour later he finally made contact with the bell. He tapped on the window to see if Victor and Richard were still alive, and he was relieved when he saw a face and two thumbs up in the porthole. It was 7:55, and they were confirmed to be alive and well during this search period. Richard and Victor had no idea of what was going on. They had been waiting without communication for over 3 hours. The bell was finally connected to the Wildrake, and they were ready to recover the bell and save the men. It was 11:40 when the wind started turning, but within just minutes another devastating mistake would destroy the tenuous connection. Masterson's choice to drag the bell at 45 degrees instead of just moving the Wildrake directly overhead would cost them everything. As the bell began moving across the seabed, it got hung up. Masterson told the crane operator to shake the crane back and forth in full heave on the line. The rest of the deck crew was stunned. This is not how diving is done. Everything should be cautious and measured. Joking on the only lifeline without repositioning the ship or sending down divers to look at the issue was reckless. At 12:20 the bell was lost again. Richard and Victor must have known exactly what happened. It had been 8 hours since the bell had lost heat. They were hypothermic, exhausted, and nearing death. Each breath was a chore to pull the cold air into their lungs. The Stena Welder was asked again to locate the bell and check what had happened. Frank spent 30 minutes looking and finally found the Wildrake's bell wedged tightly between a pipe in the sound base. At 1, he tapped in the porthole and saw the white face of Richard reacting. He was drawing hard breaths and slowly opened his eyes to see the rough seas kept the Stena Welder fighting to stay in position. Stena Welder sent down a new diver to try to rehook the lift wire and get the Wildrake men out of the water. It was 5 when he found the bell, and it was finally recovered and brought on board the Wildrake at 7:30. Despite a dozen individual heroic efforts to save the men, but unfortunately Richard and Victor did not survive. Over the next several years, the many reckless and impulsive choices were questioned by the professional diving community. Brian Masterson should not have been directing the rescue. There were many well-qualified men who had plans established to retrieve a separated bell, but his mistakes compounded with others cost these two men their lives. The company was sued in Scottish and United States courts, but they were able to evade any real consequences of these actions by claiming that they were not the actual employers of the company. Later, in a British court, 12 individuals were sued and settled with the divers' families for a small financial payout. This is the end of the video. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our new content. Thank you for watching. See you next time.